3 months ago, I was sleeping behind a diner in San Francisco, wrapped in a garbage bag, and praying the rain wouldn't soak through my only blanket. My name is Abigail, and at 29, I'd already lost everything: my home, my job, and the people I loved most. My husband, Tyler, ran off with my sister, Ashley, and together they stole not just my career, but my entire life. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. San Francisco isn't just a city of tech giants and fog, it's a city of vertical hunger. The wind off the bay doesn't just blow, it investigates. It finds every hole in your coat, every weakness in your resolve, and every memory you're trying to freeze out. For 12 weeks, I had lived as a ghost. I had learned the geometry of survival, knowing exactly which alley stayed dry during the midnight downpours and which trash bins behind the upscale bistros contained the most calories. I wasn't Abigail anymore. I had de-romanticized my existence. I was a biological unit in a state of resource depletion. I walked into Aegis Mercy Shelter because my body had finally issued a breach of contract. My toes were a ghostly shade of white, and my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. I didn't want sympathy. Sympathy is an illiquid asset in the streets. I just wanted a caloric intake and 4 hours of thermal stability. The shelter lobby smelled of industrial-grade ammonia and the heavy, humid scent of damp wool and human desperation. It was the smell of people who had been written off the ledger of society. I stood in a slow-moving line, my wet boots squeaking on the linoleum. When I finally reached the intake desk, I didn't lead with a plea. I didn't offer a story. I simply slid my worn, cracked identification card across the counter. It was my last piece of evidence that I had once been a senior strategist at Aegis Bio, a person with a salary, a title, and a future. The woman behind the desk, Joyce Mallory, didn't look up at first. She was a veteran of the discarded. She took the card with a practiced bored motion and began typing my data into a system that usually only tracked how many blankets we used. But then the clicking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and clinical. She looked at the screen, then she looked at me. Her pupils dilated until the hazel in her eyes was almost entirely gone. Her hands, calloused and steady a moment ago, began to tremble. I watched her reach for a telephone under the desk with a jerky, panicked motion. "Your name is Abigail," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of a long-standing debt. Without a word of explanation, she stood up so abruptly her chair slammed against the wall. She hurried to a back office, and a second later, I heard the metallic snap of a deadbolt. The lobby was in lockdown. She returned, her face the color of bone, and began pulling down the heavy blinds, one by one. The room dimmed, illuminated only by the flickering blue radiation of her computer monitor. I sat there, my pulse a steady, analytical thrum in my ears. I didn't feel panic. Panic is a luxury for those who still have something to lose. I felt a cold, sharp curiosity. "Ma'am," I said, my voice as steady as a balance sheet. "Is there a discrepancy with my file?" She sat down across from me and reached into a locked drawer. She pulled out a manila folder, thick and aged, sealed with heavy red tape. On the front, stamped in black ink, were the words, "Aegis Bio Research, Testament Program, Subject 9, Classified." "Abigail," she said, her voice barely a breath. "According to the official record, you're not supposed to exist. You died 25 years ago in the lab explosion that claimed your mother." I stared at the folder, but my mind was performing a different kind of audit. People look at my initial silence during Tyler and Ashley's betrayal and see weakness. They see a woman who let her husband and sister strip her of her life and her work without a fight. They don't understand the invisible chain of the survivor. I'd spent my entire life being conditioned to believe I was a burden, a spare child, in a family that only had eyes for Ashley's effortless charm. It's a psychological prison called learned helplessness. When you are treated like a background character in your own life for 20 years, survival becomes a cage. I didn't stay with Tyler because I loved him. I stayed because I had been taught that any cage was better than the void. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill with my own identity, while they overdrafted on my compassion for years. But as I looked at that folder, I realized the subscription had expired. My submission hadn't been love. It had been a survival tactic that no longer served the bottom line. Joyce opened the file. There was a photograph of a toddler. On her left shoulder was a crescent-shaped birthmark. I didn't need to look at my own shoulder to know it was an identical match. It was a serial number, disguised as a fluke of nature. "We've been searching for you for 25 years, Joyce said. "Your mother, Dr. Evelyn, didn't just want you to live. She destroyed the entire program to recode your future. She faked your death to keep you from being used as a corporate asset." I gripped the silver locket. Joyce pressed into my hand. It was cold against my skin. I looked at the photo inside a woman in a lab coat, smiling with a fierce, protective light in her eyes. My mother hadn't died in an accident. She had died in a tactical strike to protect her only successful outcome, me. I felt the last of the invisible chains snap. The warmth was gone, replaced by a clinical, lethal precision. I wasn't an ungrateful daughter or a failed wife. I was the sole survivor of a billion-dollar legacy that my husband and his father, Richard Hale, had been hunting for decades. Tyler hadn't married me for my heart. He had married me to gain proximity to the genetic source code they thought had burned to ash in '96. This wasn't a marriage, it was a long-term acquisition strategy. I looked at the door. "They're coming, aren't they?" I asked. Joyce nodded grimly. "They've tracked the system swipe. Richard Hale and Tyler are on their way to reclaim what they think is their property." I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I stood up and felt the weight of the data in that folder. It was time to stop being a victim and start being an auditor. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. And the Hale family was about to find out just how much they owed me. The betrayal by my family didn't happen in a single explosion. It was a slow, methodical leak. It began with the faint scent of Ashley's citrus perfume on Tyler's collar when he came home late from late-night meetings at the firm. It continued with the way my sister started dropping by our apartment, the one I had paid the down payment for to help Tyler with his tech issues. I saw the signs, I just didn't want to adjust the ledger. Love makes you a bad auditor, and family makes you a fool. The audit of my life was completed on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. My supervisor called me in, citing account discrepancies and fake invoices signed with my name. They didn't just fire me, they erased me. By noon, my company laptop was a paperweight and my ID was a piece of useless plastic. When I walked into my apartment, Ashley and Tyler were already there, sitting on my Italian leather couch. They didn't look guilty. They looked like they had just successfully closed a hostile takeover. "It's not personal, Abigail," Ashley had said, crossing her legs with the grace of a predator. "You were just a variable that no longer served the equation. I have a future to build, and your research is the foundation." I remember looking at the trash bin by the door as I was being escorted out. Resting on top of the coffee grounds was the anniversary watch I had bought for Ashley just a month prior. It was a limited edition piece. I'd spent $160 on money I'd saved by skipping lunches for 2 weeks. Seeing it there, discarded and stained, was the first real piece of data that broke through my conditioning. This is the psychological mechanism of normalized cruelty. For years, Ashley and Tyler hadn't seen me as a sister or a wife. They had categorized me as a resource. In their minds, they weren't being evil, they were being efficient. To them, my pain was simply a necessary overhead cost for their success. They had dehumanized me so thoroughly that they could watch me pack a single bag and walk into a rainstorm without a single flicker of remorse. They convinced themselves I deserved this for being too emotional, too in the way of their grand design. I looked at Tyler, the man who had promised to protect me. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. He was too busy looking at the patent filings on his laptop, my patent filings. I realized then that their arrogance was their greatest weakness. They didn't think I was a threat because they had spent 20 years convincing me I was a spare. They thought a biological unit without a bank account or a roof over its head had no way to fight back. They were wrong. They hadn't just taken my life. They had accidentally cleared my schedule. I left that apartment with nothing but my name and a cold, clinical clarity. If I was just a variable in their equation, then it was time to change the math. Headlights cut through the blinds of Aegis Mercy like a surgical laser through fog. The silence of the shelter was replaced by the low, expensive hum of 3 black SUVs idling on the wet asphalt. I watched through the slats as men in charcoal suits stepped out security detail, equipped with earpieces and the kind of practiced calm that usually precedes a hostile acquisition. Then, the door to the shelter didn't just open, it was breached. The air was suddenly flooded with the scent of cold rain, premium gasoline, and a familiar, suffocating citrus perfume. Richard Hale entered first. At 62, he was every inch the corporate king, silver-haired, upright, and draped in a coat that cost more than my entire previous year of salary. He didn't look at me like a daughter-in-law. He looked at me with the analytical stare of a venture capitalist inspecting a recovered prototype. To Richard, I wasn't a person with a pulse. I was a proprietary algorithm with a heartbeat. Abigail, he said, his voice a steady, low-frequency command. You've caused a significant disruption in the project timeline. It's time to close this chapter. Tyler stepped in behind him. He looked polished, successful, and entirely devoid of the man who had once made me breakfast every Sunday. He didn't check my eyes for tears. He checked my arm for the birthmark. He wasn't checking on his wife. He was verifying the serial number on his most valuable asset. Then came Ashley. She was draped in my old camel hair coat, the one she had borrowed 3 years ago and claimed had been stolen at a party. She stood there, looking at the peeling yellow paint of the shelter and the line of shivering men behind the barricade with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Look at you, Abigail," she whispered, her voice sharp as a diamond-tipped blade, "living among the discarded. It's a bit dramatic, don't you think? You always were the spare child, but this is a new low, even for you." She adjusted the collar of my coat, a smirk playing on her lips. "Don't make this a scene. You were never meant for the boardroom or the ballroom. You were made for the lab. At least there, you finally have some utility." Richard held up a manila folder identical to the one Joyce had shown me. "Your mother's legacy belongs to Heliobios, Abigail. You are the final piece of that intellectual property. We are simply taking back what we paid for 25 years ago." Tyler reached into his interior jacket pocket and produced a small, clear case containing a syringe. The liquid inside was colorless, clinical, and final. "It's a mild sedative, Abigail," he said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing a software update. "You'll wake up in a secure facility with a world-class medical team. No more garbage bags. No more rain. Just the specialized care a Subject 9 deserves." I felt the cold fury inside me turn into a hardened steel plate. They weren't even hiding it anymore. There were no more lies about affairs or account discrepancies. Those had just been the tools used to strip me of my legal protections. Now that I was Subject 9 instead of Abigail Hale, I was no longer a citizen. I was inventory. I looked at my husband, my sister, and the man who had orchestrated my ruin. Their arrogance, their absolute certainty that I would cave was breathtaking. They thought because they had stolen my home and my job, they had stolen my agency. "I'm not an asset, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through their arrogance like a cold front. "And I'm definitely not your property." Richard smiled thinly. "The data suggests otherwise, sweetheart, and in this family, the data always wins." The air in the shelter didn't just vibrate, it shattered. 1 second, Richard Hale was holding my future in a manila folder, and the next, the world was a strobe light of blue, red, and the metallic roar of authority. "FBI, nobody move." The command wasn't just a shout. It was a tactical override. Agents in black tactical vests poured through the side exits, their laser sights painting infrared targets across Tyler's chest. I didn't scream. I didn't duck in terror. I watched with clinical detachment as the balance of power shifted in 3.5 seconds. Director Mason Blackwood stepped through the chaos like he was walking into a boardroom meeting. He was tall, his trench coat flapping in the downdraft of the storm outside, his badge glinting with a cold, federal light. He didn't look at Richard Hale with fear. He looked at him with the boredom of a man about to file a long overdue indictment. "Director Blackwood," I said, my voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. He looked at me, his eyes softening for a microsecond, before returning to their default state of reinforced steel. "Miss Ward, get in the car." The drive out of San Francisco was silent. I sat in the back of the armored SUV, my arm throbbing where a stray bullet had grazed the skin. But as I watched, the wound didn't just bleed, it began to knit. By the time we crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, the jagged red line was a faint pink scar. By the time we reached the safe house, there was only smooth, unbroken skin. "Your cells regenerate 10 times faster than a normal human," Blackwood said, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "Richard Hale doesn't want to cure the world, Abigail. He wants to harvest you and sell immortality to the highest bidder." I looked at my reflection in the window, hollow-eyed, rain-soaked, and discarded. I realized then that Abigail Ward was a liability. She was a woman with a history, a family, and a heart that had been overdrafted by people who never intended to pay it back. To destroy the Hales, Abigail Ward had to be liquidated. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a strategic divestment. 6 months later, the newspapers reported that Abigail Ward had died from her injuries following the incident at the Aegis Mercy Shelter. There was a closed casket funeral in Milwaukee. I watched from across the street, hidden under a black umbrella, as Ashley clung to Tyler's arm and performed a grief she didn't feel. They were crying for the loss of their asset, not their sister. I smiled grimly. Let them think I'm Ash. It's easier to move through a house when the residents think it's not haunted. I spent those 180 days being recoded. My hair was dyed dark as an obsidian blade. My jawline was sharpened by tactical weight loss. My eyes were disguised behind high-tech lenses that changed their hue to a piercing, analytical gray. I didn't just change my name, I changed my vibration. I became Alyssa Grant, a senior consultant in biomedical logistics, with a resume so polished it was blinding. I had credentials from universities that didn't exist until Blackwood's team created them, and a professional history designed to seduce the corporate elite. 3 months after Alyssa Grant was born, Helio Biosystems hired me directly under Richard Hale. They needed a consultant to handle the logistics of their newest, most sensitive project. They thought they were hiring an apex professional to secure their legacy. They didn't realize they were inviting the auditor into the vault. Walking into the Helio headquarters was like stepping into a glass and steel cage I had built myself. Tyler passed me in the hallway on my first week. He stopped, his gaze lingering on my face for a second too long. I felt the shadow of a doubt cross his mind. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I offered him a professional, empty smile and a polite nod. "Can I help you, sir?" I asked. My voice was tempered by months of control, lower and colder than the woman he'd discarded. "No," he murmured, shaking his head. You remind me of someone I used to know." "I get that a lot," I replied. I walked away, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic count on the marble floor. Tyler didn't recognize me because he had never actually seen me. He had only seen what I could do for him. Now, as Alyssa Grant, I was going to show him exactly what happens when the spare child decides to take back the lead. The war my mother started wasn't over. I was just beginning the final audit. The server room at Helio Bio's headquarters didn't hum, it breathed. It was a digital lung, circulating millions of data points every second. As Alyssa Grant, I had gained the one thing Abigail Ward never possessed: uninhibited access to the dark ledger of Richard Hale's ambitions. It was nearly midnight when I bypassed the final encryption layer of the Testament Revival subdirectory. I wasn't looking for financial records anymore. I was looking for the biological debt they intended to collect from me. I found a file hidden beneath several layers of mislabeled administrative data. It was labeled simply Subject 0. I opened the document with a clinical steadiness. I didn't let my heart rate fluctuate. This wasn't a discovery. It was an audit of a crime scene. The file contained medical charts, cellular degradation reports, and a series of photographs taken over the last 20 years. The face in the photos was one I had seen every morning of my life. It was Ashley. But according to the data, Ashley wasn't my sister. She wasn't even a ward. She was the first prototype of the biogenetic enhancement program my mother had pioneered. While I was the successful Subject 9, the outlier who thrived, Ashley, was the error code. She was Subject 0, a prototype whose genetic modifications were built on a fault line. As I scrolled through the data, the criminal truth became undeniable. Ashley's biological systems were in a state of terminal collapse. Her organs were failing, rejecting the very modifications that were supposed to make her superior. The citrus perfume she wore wasn't just a signature scent. It was a heavy chemical mask for the faint, sickly smell of internal decay. The report on Tyler's private drive was the final piece of evidence. Under the heading Harvest Protocol, Tyler had detailed a plan for immune system harmonization. They didn't want my research to build a new company. They wanted my physical body to save their failing asset. Because my cells regenerated 10 times faster than normal, I was the only compatible donor for Ashley's failing biology. They hadn't just stolen my career. They were planning to harvest me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of Subject 9 but empty space. Tyler hadn't been waiting for me to come home from the shelter. He had been waiting for the inventory to be delivered to the surgical suite. The betrayal I felt months ago, the sting of my husband running off with my sister, felt laughably small now. It was like worrying about a scratch on a car that was about to be crushed for scrap. This wasn't a family drama. This was a sophisticated, high-stakes organ harvesting operation disguised as a corporate merger. Ashley wasn't a rival. She was a biological parasite. I closed the file and encrypted the access logs. I sat in the blue glow of the monitor, my mind a cold, empty room. I thought about the 3 years I had spent working late, coming home to Tyler's fake coffee and Ashley's fake smiles. Every I love you from my husband had been a lie told to a piece of equipment. Every sisterly advice from Ashley had been an inspection by a predator. They thought they had flushed me out. They thought Alyssa Grant was just another high-priced consultant they could use to secure their immortality. They didn't realize that the asset they were so desperate to own had already been declassified. I looked at the silver locket from my mother. It felt heavy now, like a gavel. The audit was complete. The debts were verified. All that remained was the execution of judgment. The annual Helio Research Gala was in 48 hours. It was a masquerade, a glittering stage where billionaires wore masks to pretend they weren't monsters. I would be there. I would wear my silver mask. And I would finally show the Hale family exactly what happens when the variable they tried to delete becomes the only one that matters. The grand ballroom of the Helio Bio's headquarters was a masterclass in the theater of the elite. Crystal chandeliers refracted light through 10,000 facets, blinding the guests to the moral rot hidden in the foundation. Everyone wore a mask, some made of silk and feathers, others made of carefully maintained social standings. I moved through the crowd as Alyssa Grant, my silver mask, a cold, reflective barrier. I wasn't just a guest. I was the virus in their operating system, and the clock was counting down to 0. I found Richard, Tyler, and Ashley at the center of the floor, holding court. Richard was discussing the future of legacy, his voice full of the arrogance of a man who thought he had purchased eternity. Ashley stood beside him, clutching her designer purse, her emerald dress vibrant, but unable to mask that faint, sickly scent I now knew was her own genetic failure. Tyler was feeding lies to investors, his smile as empty as a cleared bank account. When I approached, he turned, his eyes searching my mask with a flicker of misplaced charm. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice unguarded. I tilted my head slightly and reached for the silk ribbon at the back of my head. "You already did," I said. my voice dropping into a register he hadn't heard in 6 months. I let the silver mask fall to the marble floor. The sound of it hitting the stone was a sharp, final punctuation mark. The color didn't just leave Tyler's face, it evacuated. "Abigail?" he whispered, his jaw going slack. Ashley's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide, with a terror that no amount of wealth could soothe. Richard Hale stood frozen, his corporate facade cracking to reveal the panicked predator underneath. Before they could speak, I raised my tablet, the screen glowing with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of encrypted files, medical reports, and the truth about Subject 0 and Subject 9. "The digital payload was delivered to the Department of Justice 3 minutes ago," I said, my voice a clinical statement of fact. "Every illegal trial, every harvest protocol, every crime against humanity you buried under a corporate seal is now a matter of public record." Sirens wailed outside a discordant symphony that shattered the gala's artificial peace. The ballroom doors slammed open, and federal agents poured in, their badges flashing under the crystal lights. Richard tried to push through the crowd, a desperate attempt to maintain the hierarchy he'd built on stolen blood. But the authority he thought he owned was gone. As the cuffs clicked shut around their wrists, I looked at their faces and saw the illusion of power from an empty wallet. This moment was the absolute peak of their downfall. It was the psychological exposure of the elite who build their identities on assets instead of character. I watched as the arrogance drained from them, replaced by a hollow, shaking fear. There is a fundamental difference between having wealth and being a person of substance. Their power was never internal. It was a shell rented by money. Now that the accounts were frozen and the assets were scheduled for seizure, they weren't just criminals, they were nothing. I realized they weren't shocked by the immorality of their crimes. They were shocked that their currency no longer bought them immunity. Without the financial buffer to protect their egos, they had no intrinsic value to stand on. Tyler looked up at me as he was forced to his knees, his eyes begging for a mercy I had already liquidated. "Abigail, please," he choked out, still reaching for the woman he thought he could control. I leaned down, my face inches from his. "My name is Abigail," I whispered, cold and final. "You took everything from me because you thought I was a resource to be harvested. Now, you'll live with the one thing you never bothered to build your own empty self." I turned away as the sound of sirens swallowed his final plea. The gala was over. The theater of the Hales had been shut down. For the first time in 29 years, the balance sheet of my life was finally in the black. The resolution of the Hale empire was as clinical as a lab report. Richard Hale received a life sentence for crimes against humanity and illegal genetic experimentation. Tyler was sentenced to 20 years for conspiracy and fraud. Ashley, ever the survivalist, testified against them in exchange for immunity. The last I heard, she was working in a small diner outside the city, a literal ghost of the woman who once thought she could harvest my life to save her own. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to see the hammer fall to know the audit was closed. My presence wasn't required for justice to take its natural course. Instead, I spent that day at the new headquarters of the Evelyn Foundation, a beautiful building in San Francisco dedicated to children with terminal genetic disorders. I used $85 million of seized assets to fund legal support, counseling, and medical treatment for those who had been told there was no hope. This wasn't a charity project. It was the restoration of my mother's original intent, mercy, not manipulation. I still live in the shadows, but I'm no longer hiding. I travel between facilities under the name Alyssa Grant, coordinating the ethical transport of experimental treatments. Alyssa is a professional construct, Abigail Ward is a buried memory, and Lydia Cross is a classified success. I am simply a woman who survived a hostile takeover and emerged as the owner of her own soul. Sometimes I go back to the beach and look at the ocean, letting the wind clear the last of the citrus perfume from my senses. I opened my old encrypted files, the ones that held every betrayal and every moment I spent as a spare, and I hit the delete key. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. We spend our lives running from pain, But sometimes pain is the only auditor that forces us to see our true value. My mother didn't create a weapon for war. She created a person meant for healing. I was never a failed experiment. I was the justice they never saw coming. If you believe that true character outshines blood every time, please like and share this video. Subscribe to join us for more journeys of rebirth. Thank you for listening.